Hey everyone, Nubkeks here, and in today's video I want to talk about Shadow Priest in World of Warcraft, and particularly how we're looking in the Shadowlands Alpha and looking forwards into Shadowlands Beta and eventually release. As you guys know, Shadow Priest is regarded as possibly the worst spec at the moment on Shadowlands Alpha in terms of design, so I want to give my feedback on what some of the problems that Shadow Priest is now on the live servers and what some of the problems are on Alpha. And could be in Shadowlands, and some of my ideas on how they might fix it or what I would like to see them do to change, and obviously feedback as well on the changes that they've already made, which are hit and miss. They're definitely hit and miss. In the background, this is just doing the first 5 mass clear on my priest. As you guys know, I main Shadow Priest, of course, in Battle of Tsar lore and in Eternal Palace. If you want to see some like competitive, I guess, Shadow Priest gameplay, you can check out you can find videos on the channel of like Eternal Palace and see it in action with essences. Yeah, this is just kind of more casual gameplay, but that's part of the problem for Shadow Priest. So hey, I guess it works out okay. You can see some of the struggles for the spec, I suppose. But yeah, I want to talk about what the problem is with Shadow Priest now in BFA first, and before we break down what some of the problems will be on Shadowlands, because you kind of need to understand the two. The biggest problem in BFA is that the Shadow Priest is an extremely ramp-up focused spec, and in fact, not only do we ramp up, but we ramp up off of our ramp-up. The way this works is it's because of the Azerite trait, Chorus of Insanity. So we have Void Form. So you can see Void Form in action there. The weak aura is in the middle of the screen, give you a really good indication of what's happening, right? Every second we're in Void Form. We generate a stack of Void Form. That makes our sanity, which is that bar below that. That makes the sanity drain faster. We generate, drains faster. We generate sanity with most of our abilities. And each stack of Void Form also gives you half a percentage point of haste. So like a 20-second Void Form gives you 10% haste. A 40-second Void Form will give you 20% haste. Chorus of Insanity, the Azerite trait, which we typically stack 3 of. Now, obviously in late Nyalotha here, with the corruption vendor and very high corruption on our gear, people are able to do a different build, which only has 2 Chorus of Insanity. I won't really get into it here, but it's just kind of interesting, so you can look that up if you're curious. But for most of BFA, from patch 8.1 on, when we were kind of more viable with the extra ring of Azerite traits, triple Chorus of Insanity is the thing to do. And that gives you a ton of crit when your Void Form ends, based off of how many Void Form stacks that you have. And you couple that with the Lingering Insanity talent, which makes your Void Form haste bonus drop by 1% every 3 seconds after you leave Void Form instead of instantly. By default, it drops instantly. You put those two together, and that's where the power of the Shadow Priest comes from at the moment, right? So you build up a big, let's just say, like not even a big Void Form. Let's say for just clarity's sake, a 30-second Void Form, a 30-stack Void Form. Not a good Void Form in a raid situation at all, or probably any situation at all. But it's just an easy number. So I mean, you get 15% haste from that, right? And you're gonna get 30 stacks of Chorus of Insanity. So once your Void Form ends, well, cool. You're gonna have tons of haste. You're gonna have tons of crit. So you're just gonna be doing way more damage, and that's where your power spike comes from. Now, the ramp up off the ramp up also comes because these things keep going right into your next Void Form, right? Because they last for so long that extra haste, that extra crit, and both of those stats help you generate sanity. Haste, obviously, you get to cast more spells, and crit because your Shadow Word Void, your Mind Blast. We always take the Shadow Word Void talent though, which makes your Mind Blast a different ability. That generates more sanity when you crit. Your shadows that you produce, your shadowy apparitions, give you a little bit of sanity, and they are produced whenever your Shadow Word Pain crits. So yeah, more crit and haste. It really scales quite exponentially. Put that stuff all together, it makes your second Void Form then even more powerful than your first, because that second Void Form can last longer and get more stacks because it is buoyed up by the Chorus of Insanity stacks that you've carried over from your first Void Form and from the haste that you've carried over with Lingering Insanity. So there's a bunch of problems that go with that. Obviously, I mean, like a 30-second Void Form, I said, is a pretty short one. Typically, they're even longer than that, which means that you can spend a serious portion of the fight ramping up. So in situations, let's say like Queen Ashara, where there was an intermission, that can be pretty rough. I mean, in current content, let's say Rathian is a great example of a boss fight, which kind of sucks. Because, hey, you build up your first Void Form, you get your second one, you're like, hey, cool, the ball's rolling, I'm doing great. And then Rathian like phases away and you have to run away to the other side of the room and you can't hit him, right? Stuff like that is really punishing. Even more so, world content can be very punishing, where it's difficult to keep those Void Forms rolling because, I mean, there might not be the density of quest mobs, so you might have to like fly around to different areas or pick up items, whatever, so it can be feel weak in that. Not as much of an issue, of course, because world content is very easy. It can also be a problem in Mythic Plus on Tyrannical weeks, or in just low-level Mythic Plus in general. It's going to be a problem because mobs will die so quickly that like time actually fighting the mobs will be quite low, and time running between mob packs will be quite high, especially if you've got a tank. You know, like for example, if your tank takes 3 seconds to think about what pack they're going to pull next, that's really punishing because it means that your Void Form is going to drop early, which means your next Void Form is weaker, and blah blah blah. So that stuff together, I think, really is the main problem with Shadow Priest in BFA, is that Chorus of Insanity and Lingering Insanity, while they do make your spec very powerful and it can do a lot of damage, especially so in like a council fight type situation, or like a fight like Sakul was probably our most obviously insane fighter. What I can't remember the first boss, what it was called in Crucible of Storms, but like Shadow Priest was insane there, council type fight. That sort of stuff caters really well to us. But yeah, there's also a lot of downsides to it. You know, the spec is inherently ramp based. You're ramping up with extra haste and Void Form. Like, that's how it works. We don't have major cooldowns. It's all about the Void Form. But being based around Chorus of Insanity and Lingering Insanity, which comes after, it's not just ramping up the Void Form, but it's the power comes after that Void Form, and then it's about ramping up into your second Void Form with that power. That's the big problem with BFA. Now, in Legion it was different, right? In Legion it was different. It was still a big problem with ramp up. In Legion, though, what happened was that you got 1% haste for each stack of Void Form. So like a 40-second Void Form in Legion would give you 40% haste compared to 20% haste in BFA. That's a very big difference. And then you also had a Mass Hysteria Azerite trait, or not Azerite, excuse me, Artifact Weapon trait, which increased the damage of your dots by 2% every second, so every stack of Void Form. That was super strong. So imagine like 30 seconds into Void Form in BFA, and in Shadowlands Alpha, that gives you 15% haste. In Legion, 30 seconds into a Void Form is giving you 30% haste and 60% more damage on your Shadow Word Pain and a Vampiric Touch. So that obviously added up into a lot more damage. Now, it was still very ramping, right? So it was very much a ramping spec, but it wasn't as backloaded as it is in BFA. An issue that has been in both expansions, of course, then is an issue of scaling and an issue of balance, which is that the longer your Void Form goes, like, you know, 5 seconds at the start of your Void Form, you're not doing a whole, like, you think about Legion, 5 seconds at the start of your Void Form, you're not doing a whole lot. But you imagine, like, 5 seconds of extra Void Form, like, between 30 and 35 seconds, if you get those extra 5 seconds, and you've got 30% haste or more, and you've got 60% bonus dot damage or more, like, the damage scaling is insane. Every second that you add on to that is more powerful than the second that came before. Same thing in BFA. Every second you add on to Void Form gives more stacks once that Void Form ends, which means that because the stacks decay at a fixed rate, the more stacks you have, the further they carry into your subsequent Void Form. And obviously that stacks really well with the haste that you're generating from that Void Form as well, and so on. Right, so there's a big issue with scaling. Like in BFA, we've been nerfed nearly every major raid. We get massive nerfs at the start of the tier just because we're going to scale so well. And obviously, the more crit we have, the more haste we have, all that stuff scales together and gets really powerful. So I think that's one of the main concerns. One of the biggest problems at Shadow Priest in these two expansions has been that we are a very ramping base class. That's not necessarily a crippling problem in of itself. This is my fault for, yeah, I think I get screwed here. It's totally my fault for pulling that boss when I was going to get stunned. Embarrassing. Should have waited for that stun stacks to drop. Anyway, I remember getting pissed off about this. But there's a big balance problem tied into it as well. And just the ramping nature does mean that we're weak in the content that a lot of players will typically do, like solo content and lower level Mythic Plus, right? The problem on Shadowlands then is without the Mass Hysteria, or the which is the stacking dot damage from Legion Void Form, and without the big haste bonus of Legion Void Form, without Chorus of Insanity from BFA, that those are the two real big power sources for Void Form. With those things gone, all that you get from Void Form now on Shadowlands is you get access to Void Bolts. Void Bolts is, of course, you know, it's a core part of a rotation. Essentially, you've got Void Bolt, filler, filler, Void Bolt, filler, filler. That's the rotation. You can only use that in Void Form, so you get that, and you obviously get the flat spell power you get for being in Void Form. But that's really all that you're going to get. You're going to get the haste, you know, like 30 seconds in Void Form, you're going to get that 15% extra haste. But that's all you get. You're not getting that scaling dot damage. You're not getting the big Chorus of Insanity boost afterwards. And what this means is that Void Form feels very unrewarding. That's one of the big pieces of feedback from the Shadow Priest that have been playing on the alpha, is that Void Form just doesn't feel great. It doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of point to being in Void Form. You're just not getting that much out of it at all. So that's one of the big issues. I think it's not that difficult necessarily to solve, though. I wish I had the post. I read a great post from one Shadow Priest who's giving feedback, and he had great ideas, because he was basically undermining all the stuff that the Shadow Priests want to see. Like, one of the common piece of feedback is just make Chorus of Insanity, like Mass Hysteria, make the dot stacking baseline, make Chorus of Insanity baseline, you know, make Lingering Insanity, which lets the haste buff trigger over, make that baseline. Just make this stuff baseline, but that just brings the same problem over. Like, if you make Chorus of Insanity baseline, you're baking in this ramp up and then ramping up off the back of your ramp up. You're baking that in baseline to your class. And he made a great point, which was that instead of Void Form being about how many stacks can I get to ramp up that dot damage, to ramp up that Chorus of Insanity, instead of that, they need to add more into Void Form that makes simply being in Void Form really good. So it's not about racking up as many stacks as you can, but just, I feel good that I'm in Void Form. So something like, you know, a couple of examples, what they could do, just flat stats could work, right? Just give a flat, you know, 10-20% crit. I think like a 20% crit in Void Form, that's gonna feel not too bad. It's not great, not the best option. You know, this is just a very simple thing they could do, but you know, you will see more ghosts coming out because your Shadow Word Pain will crit more, so you'll visibly see, oh yeah, look, I'm in Void Form and I see more ghosts flying out. That's cool. And I see more big crit numbers pop up. Okay, cool. That's gonna feel a little bit better. So, you know, that's one example of what they can do, and it doesn't matter really how many stacks you have. You're getting that flat percentage bonus no matter what. I think that's a pretty cool thing they could do. In my opinion, I've been thinking about this a little bit, because one of the changes that they made on the alpha was they added in Devouring Plague. It's pretty problematic, and that's one of the slightly depressing things, is that they've added these changes for Shadow Priest that just haven't been great. Devouring Plague is one of them. So as it is right now, it's a different way to spend your sanity. It costs 50 sanity, it does a chunk of damage up front, and then it does a dot that does that amount of damage again over 12 seconds. The problem is that it's just really, really weak, and it's just not worth casting at its current tuning levels. And their idea was that it would help you out in world content, for example, that you could, you know, use Devouring Plague instead of building up to a Void Form. Of course, the issue being that, well, 12-second dot is still quite a long dot, so the mob has to live for 12 seconds to get the value out of it. And of course, Void Form doesn't actually cost sanity to activate. It just starts draining sanity, and the drain is quite slow at the start. And when you activate Void Form, you do a Void Eruption, which actually does a lot of damage, and it's AoE damage. So in every circumstance, with the current implementation of Devouring Plague, you're always better off entering Void Form first. It's quite degenerate. Like, if you want the most burst damage, you just want to enter Void Form, then spam a couple of Devouring Plagues to cancel Void Form, then build up to another Void Form just to get as many Void Eruptions out as you can. So it's quite weird. It doesn't quite work. I think what they could do is build in Devouring Plague as an extra button, and unfortunately they've said that this is something they don't want to do. I really think that they should do it, though, and I think there is space for doing it. They don't want to add an extra rotational button. I think that, in fact, they can. Shadow Priest has quite a simple rotation. It's just very punishing when it gets interrupted by, you know, having to do mechanics or having to move, that sort of thing. But the rotation itself is quite simple. You know, it's like Void Bolt, Shadow Word Void, Mind Flay, Void Bolt, Mind Flay, Void Bolt, Void Bolts, Shadow Word Void, Mind Flay Void Bolts, that sort of thing. It's quite simple. There's not a lot of buttons to press, and obviously maintaining your dots is more interesting in multi-target, multi-dotting and stuff like that. But I think there's a big possibility to add in Devouring Plague as something that you get from being in Void form. A couple of ways they could do it. I mean, quite possibly just, every few seconds you're in Void form, let's say every 10 seconds in Void form, you auto-generate a charge of Devouring Plague, which you can then spend. Okay, cool. I think that would be pretty all right. That could work. You could have, bring in the old Shadow Orbs that would work off Void Bolt. I think that could be okay too. Essentially combo points, right? That every Void Bolt and perhaps like a chance off of your Shadowy Apparitions, something like that, would generate a Shadowy Orb, and you could spend that on Devouring Plague. Like I said, I've been thinking about this a little bit. My current thinking of what might be quite fun would be if add in that baseline crit, add in like 20% baseline crit to Void form, and then have it be that whenever your Void Bolt crits, that you would proc the ability to cast Devouring Plague. So make it like a proc type thing, and then obviously the more your Void Bolt crits. In single target, it's obviously pretty straightforward. You just press the proc button, cool. But in multi-target, you could potentially spread that around. That could be kind of fun and kind of nice. And you could obviously make your Shadowy Apparitions have a small chance to trigger it as well, so it sort of scales up in multi-target. And there's a bit more randomness to it as well. I think that'd be kind of fun, and the randomness would be quite good for the Void form theme. So stuff like that, I think, that sort of gist, I think could work actually really, really well. Alternatively, again, just have it be a combo point, like essentially have it just be combo points and Rupture from the Rogue, right? Have Devouring Plague be an extra dot that would scale up maybe in damage and duration, and generate combo points. And Void Bolt being a generator, you get more of those casts out while in Void form. So it would kind of it would feel that your rotation is noticeably faster, and you're doing more Devouring Plagues and stuff while you are in Void form. I think that could be kind of cool. I think going in that direction would be kind of nice. It just gives you an extra button to press that feels good. Again, Devouring Plague at the moment with their current iteration, because it spent sanity, is kind of weird, and you could easily end up in situations where you go, the value of not pressing the button is just a trap button to press because you want to maximize your Void form as much as possible in a lot of situations, and I think that's bad, and that's not great. What I will say as well, because it's super popular feedback from a lot of Shadow Priests, a lot of people, well, let me reiterate, super big feedback on Shadow Priests, not necessarily from Shadow Priests, is they want to see Void form removed as a mechanic, or they want to see Void form become a much simpler, just like 2-minute cooldown. Essentially, a lot of suggestions would make it out to be just essentially a carbon copy of Crusade from a Ret Paladin, which is one of their top tier talents, which just updates Avenging Wrath to have a sort of stacking haste effect. They want it to be that. In my opinion, that would be a big loss. I don't want us to have that happen. I do think that having, a Shadow Priest that is essentially a ranged Ret Paladin with a focus on dot damage, I do think that would be fun. I like Ret Paladin. One of my alts, I play Ret Paladin, and I enjoy it. I think it'd be fun, but I think you'd lose a lot of the uniqueness. A lot of people argue that Void form is a failed mechanic and blah, blah, blah. I think certainly the mechanic, there's strengths and weaknesses to the spec and to the class, but I think fundamentally that Void form, it's unique. There's no other mechanic quite like it in the game, and I think that's cool. There's a lot of builder spender type classes. There's no other Void form type class, and I think that's awesome. I think that's worth holding on to. And I like the idea of just the core rotation being simple, but that your core rotation does noticeably speed up over the course of Void form. And that the Insanity Drain, you're kind of like striving to stay in as long as you can and get the most out of it. I really enjoy that, and not having big cooldowns. I appreciate that some people obviously don't like it, but there are other classes you can play that provide, other gameplay styles. And, if you get rid of Void form as it is, there's just nowhere to go to get something like that, right? Which I think would suck. So I really would like to have it stay in. And I do think, like I said, that adding Devouring Plague probably as a proc, or else adding just some flat benefit to being in Void form is the way to go. The flat benefit fixes problems of scaling, and I think, an extra rotational button actually could work reasonably well. Now, they have added other stuff as well in the alpha. So Shadow Word Death has come back. There's been a couple of issues with Shadow Word Death. So one big thing is that it reflects damage, which is cool. It's kind of thematically cool. Now, one big issue is that it does double damage when you use it on a target in execute range, and with the scaling, that actually absolutely chunks you. I think if you crit on alpha right now, you can do over half of your health, your max health that is, in damage to yourself with the Shadow Word Death crit, which is kind of ridiculous. So that's not great. It's just a bit weird. They want you to press the button only when it's in execute, but I don't know. Like, for me, it just doesn't quite make sense. I quite like the idea of it costing damage. I would rather it, though, be just a flat health thing, because the big concern, of course, is that, well, spell power scales faster than health does in an expansion. So if we're already taking off half of our health with a crit and execute, like 1 or 2 patches down the line, they're going to have to rebalance it, because we will literally one-shot ourselves eventually with these crits, which would not be good. I'd rather just did like a flat health cost, like whatever, it costs 10 or 20% of your max health to cast Shadow Word Death. That'd be fine, and then have it only be castable on targets in execute. I don't really see a big issue with that. If we're only supposed to be casting it in execute anyway, then why not only cast it in execute? You know, it's kind of, it doesn't need to be a button that you can press in other circumstances, like execute for warrior. Hey, it's got that in the name. You only cast it, you can actively only press it on targets that are in execute. There was a big problem with Void Bolt rank 2, which was a bit worrying. It was a bit worrying, where they made it so that you could cast Void Bolt during Mind Flay, sort of like a Mistweaver monk can cast Vivify during Soothing Mist, but obviously Mind Flay's a really short channel, so stuff clipped really badly. It just was not good, and it also removed our only little bit of movement and stutter stepping, and just, you know, having to spam Mind Flay a couple of GCDs in a row so it wouldn't clip the Void Bolt. It was just super awkward. It wasn't good. They have removed that, so that's good. That was a little scary that they put it in the first place. We have some interesting utility with Mind Soothe coming in, which I think is cool, which lets you reduce the threat radius of a target, so that's kind of nice for Mythic Plus. I think Shadow Priest is totally fine on utility, like with Life Grip, with Mass Dispel. We've got a Disease Dispel, right? We have a Purge, which is awesome. You know, Shackle Undead is sometimes useful as well. Like, I feel like we have enough utility, and with Mind Suit, that's going to be pretty cool. Power Infusion is a question mark for me. This is a new cooldown we're going to have, which gives haste. It's like a 2-minute cooldown that gives haste to the target, but we can cast it on other people. It's a bit wonky. Like, it's one of those things where you're going to want to cast it on yourself, but it's not fully efficient to cast on yourself because you lose 1 GCD. I don't know, like, for me, being able to cast on other targets, I feel like that's just going to lead to a little bit of drama, right, where different people are going to want it, because for them it feels the best, right? They obviously want to get Power Infusion on themselves during their cooldown, and I don't think it's obvious, you know, like which spec is going to be best with Power Infusion. That sort of stuff is not necessarily obvious, and people are going to get upset about it, so I'm not sure if it's a great idea. I don't necessarily hate it, I'm not 100% sure, so that's a bit on the fence for me. There's an issue with the Mind Blast CD, where they slightly increased the CD of Mind Blast, but now it doesn't sync up with the global cooldown, so it becomes very clunky to use in Void form, and you have to leave it sit off the global cooldown for a bit before you can cast it, which just feels wrong, and it forces you to take Shadow Word Void even more so than we're already forced to take Shadow Word Void. It was a mandatory, it gives you, essentially, it was a Legion legendary that gave 2 charges to Mind Blast, so it was mandatory in Legion. Now it's a talent on the level 15 row in BFA, and it's mandatory as well, except for PvP where you take Shadow Infusion, but in all PvE content it's mandatory. So I don't think it's great. I think the Shadow Priest generally, their talent tree is pretty bad. I definitely think that their talent tree, and for many specs, I think the talent trees would actually be much better if they baselined several of the talents and got rid of some of the clearly filler talents, and trimmed it down to a much smaller talent tree of actually interesting choices. I think that could be kind of cool. Like, I've quite enjoyed in BFA getting to play with different major essences as the kind of talent thing. So for Shadow Priest, obviously in this video in the background, you're seeing me use the Focus Azurite Beam, which is 1.5 minute AoE cooldown. If you check out some of the Eternal Palace stuff, you'll see fights where I run Guardian of Azeroth, which is a 3-minute single target cooldown. you'll see ones where I use the 2-minute Memory of Lucid Dream, which was really fun for Shadow Priest. It doubled your sanity generation for 15 seconds, so it lets you ramp up a really, really big void form. So that was really cool, especially on fights where you could use that extra haste and crit to really pump up, especially split cleave damage with dots on multiple targets. That was awesome. So that stuff was cool, and I'd like to see something with that in the talents. But yeah, our talents definitely need something to be desired. Some of the Covenant stuff is, I feel like that's still quite early in testing, and I haven't got to play it myself, so I won't give feedback in this video. But those are, I think, some of the big baseline questions with Shadow Priest. Again, I like Void Form. I want Void Form to stay. I'm not part of the anti-Void Form crew, and I think losing Void Form would lose something that's important to the game. However, I think that Void Form does have a problem that it has a balancing and a scaling problem because of its ramping qualities. And while I think the ramping qualities, I think they got the right amount of BFA. I think they got the right amount. Where the ramping haste and the ramping sanity drain feels fun for the rotation. I think that's good. But I think getting some flat bonuses on top of that scaling haste would be good, so that Void Form feels better. Like I said, I favor a proc base Devouring Plague. Devouring Plague procking off, let's say, Void Bolt casts or Void Bolt crits, or possibly off of Shadowy Apparitions as well. That would feel pretty cool. I would enjoy that. It'd give you some more single target and some more some more focused priority damage. I think that'd be fun, and a bit of randomness I think fits the theme of Void. So I think that could be nice. I would actually like to see as well, like, I think Lingering Insanity, instead of making that baseline, instead of making Course of Insanity baseline, I think those lead to bad practices. It makes the ramp up worse. I think just getting rid of those, honestly, is a better thing to do. So I would like to see those go myself. And I think a lot of talents could go. I might do another video on that. But yeah, there you go, guys. There's some of my thoughts on the Shadow Priest and what it's looking like in the Shadowlands Alpha. It's definitely a question mark. I mean, I would love to be able to main Shadow Priest next expansion. I hope that I'll be able to do it. I'm just definitely a bit concerned that some of the changes so far, like Void Bolt Rank 2, Devouring Plague, have left a lot to be desired so far. So hopefully that stuff can improve. And there's some of my thoughts on what they could or ought to do with the Shadow Priest. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.